Hey guys, so this video is not going to be about painting. Usually painting is the thing I like to focus on. I like to create nice and storytelling driven scenes, vibrant images. But actually the main thing I tend to do for a living is character design, specifically stylized character design for video games. Now this character that I'm working on is a good demonstration of how I would generally approach my design process, especially if I have a good solid background already for the character. In this case, for example, this character is a character for my D&D campaign that I'm going to partake in with a bunch of friends. All of the friends that I'm doing this with are also artists, which is great to see. I get to see all of the different characters that they're coming up with. The designs are awesome, and hopefully it'll lead me into creating some new fantasy illustrations as well. So stylized character design is something I have gravitated to in the past, let's say 3 years, 2 years. And it actually was the first professional concept art gig that I had, designing a stylized character for a sci-fi game. It's just a lot of fun to figure out how you can actually exaggerate certain features, twist proportions, simplify shapes into being very graphic in nature, embolden things, and there's so many opportunities to just create a very charismatic and playful design with a lot of personality, and that is the thing that I'm focusing on when I'm doing these kind of character designs. So my character here, for example, as I mentioned, it's my D&D character who is a Tortle slash paladin, which means I wanted him to be like slightly noble, a little bit bulky, but he has a particular personality that I cannot disclose quite yet, because my friends of my campaign might be watching, and that's gonna have to be a secret until they figure it out during the campaign itself. But the character design should hopefully already give some hints as to who he is and what he is going to be like. But just based on the description, Tortle and Paladin, I immediately had a couple of limitations to work with. And I was looking for different ways to make this turn into something interesting. I didn't really look up pictures of turtles on what they were looking like. If I have a mood board in this case aside, it's more so going to be, well, just real life images of turtles, and I'm going to use those as inspiration, not any type of artwork, because I don't want to influence my decision making by the work someone else has already designed. But in this case, after my first design, which I wasn't very happy with, and my second design, not so happy with, I discovered the shell is actually something that I can be rather flexible with, and I can sort of push it to the point where it would be, well, maybe a little bit unclear on whether or not it's a turtle still, but I wanted to see how far I could push things, especially since he has an organic shape to him. That is a good excuse to try out very graphic and bold shape design, rather than limit myself by sticking with too realistic proportions or something that's even too close to an actual turtle. So you can see me pushing and pulling shapes, starting off with very clean and simple silhouettes for the most part. Like I have an egg shape, I have a lot of just very big blocky shapes. Overall nothing very detailed. The detail that is in there is important to the design, but I'm skipping the detail parts until the later phases. At first it's just putting the building blocks of my design in place, making sure I have the proportions that I want, the shape language that I want, the shape design that I want, and that it represents the personality of the character I want him to be. So it's a lot of pushing and pulling, figuring out where I want to take the design. Some of them are a bit too bulky, feel a little bit too oath-ish, too bulky, maybe a bit too stupid, while others maybe have a little bit of too much authority over them. They don't really appear kind enough, and some of them maybe have the opposite problem where they're a bit too kind. So it's balancing all of the information that we have based on my knowledge and fundamentals. Once I have my designs ready, that's when I usually skip to the next step, and I will either start exploring more specifically within one of these designs, or I will just decide I have enough to go off of to create my final sketch. In this case, I really like this guy. I thought it was a fun shape where the shell kinda follows the entirety of the back arch with just a couple of spikes sticking out, so it's an overly round and blocky character with a couple of spiky accents, which I think is a very nice balance between someone who looks combat ready but mostly has to look reliable. I'm guessing most of you have probably heard about the kinds of shapes that tell different stories. As you know, squares, authoritarian, military, sturdy, reliable, triangles, dangerous, so to speak. Well, I don't necessarily like to stick to it that much. I do think we need to consider rigid versus flexible. That's going to be a main thing that decides what our character is actually gonna portray and what kind of vibe he's gonna show. In this case, character was overall working pretty fine, but I wanted to bulk him up a little bit more to really emphasize the fact that he's a bit more reliable, a little bit more sturdy, moving into line art, adding in some of the details, but not going into a finished line art, because the end result of my character was actually going to be painted, so it would be potentially a little bit of a waste of time to spend too long in the line art phase. Now, what I do use these drawing stages for, it is basically to know what the form is to my 2D shapes. In the thumbnail phase, it's a lot of 2D graphical shape design. The risk you have there is, as long as you're not defining the three-dimensionality of the 2D shape, you might run into troubles when you later on decide to render it. So while I'm putting this line art together, I'm really trying to consider the three-dimensional form, which shapes are sticking out more, where I maybe have a little bit of a dent in the design. Basically, the topography of the entire Tortle needs to be quite clear. And while I'm doing this, it's mainly just making sure that that's readable. Sometimes I might get a bit carried away with the detail. That's perfectly fine, as long as you're enjoying yourself. I don't see why you cannot get lost in detail. But of course, we don't want to get into detail up until we have our final design. So right now I don't mind, but during the thumbnailing process, I definitely would advise just trying to stay as simple and as readable as you can without going into unnecessary details. Once I have my line art put under a silhouette, and I start just breaking up the values of the character, because I have my main silhouette, and I think it's a quite readable silhouette. It's simple in nature with a little bit of complexity, but when I add in those values, that's when I can actually differentiate the secondary shapes on the inside of my design. And how do I do that? By creating edges between them, and edges are created by value differences, for example. So I want to figure out which parts of my design are going to be bright and which parts of my design are going to be dark. That way I can arrange them so that I can create still the most amount of contrast, hopefully around where the face is, because the shell above the head is quite dark, for example, and the face itself is going to be quite bright. It's going to be sticking out, it's going to be lit up, which immediately hopefully draws in the eye towards that face and creates a bit of a focal point. You want to be very particular with how you arrange these values. I used to learn, or I was taught at least, that it's a good idea to go for what we call the light-dark light sandwich, or the dark-light-dark sandwich, where you basically arrange 3 to 5 groups of different values in a nice and appealing way. So you don't want to overcomplicate it with a lot of tiny little shapes. I'm still working with big and bulky shapes, as you can see. Detail still not in the picture. It's mainly, I have my silhouette is working, I zoom in, I then come up with my secondary shapes, just separating them, dark and light, until I have them settled down. I'm not going to move into adding those finer details yet. Right now it's mainly getting this to a solid point. The important thing is taking this slowly, gradually. We don't want to rush through a design process. We want to make very conscious decisions. Like, a character like this doesn't take me too long to make, but the main reason for that is because I tend to slow down in order for things to speed up. I don't like to skip steps. I'm basically pacing myself to make sure that the decisions I make are the right ones, rather than continuously correcting bad decisions. I'm guessing some of you might have the habit of just putting a brushstroke down, undoing, and so on and so on. And of course, that's the benefits of digital art. But if you would just, like, and I've learned this from actually watching Evan Amundsen. I met him at a convention in Berlin. I asked him to draw a sketch in my sketchbook, and he was very nice about it. He immediately asked for a brush pen, started inking a character in there. And the thing that stood out to me immediately was just the amount of time he spends in between his lines, in between his brush strokes. Not rushing through things, taking his time, and making sure everything's just a conscious decision, because as long as it's a conscious decision and you're making it feel like it's deliberate, it's going to be a successful design. And I've really taken that to heart and tried to apply that in my own workflow, trying to learn, or trying to teach myself rather, to slow down, take it easy, and you'll notice that as a consequence, things will start speeding up rather quickly. Now, of course, when you're working on a character, at some point you'll get to the rendering stage, and rendering is the one thing that's going to take a while, depending on how much you want to render things. In my case, it's still just a bare minimum of form definition. Basically, all I've done is decide which edges are soft and which edges are hard. And then on the inside of the larger planes, differentiate the color a little bit, so I don't have a single hue. Like for a single surface, it's always going to be lots of variation between the color depending on the ambient light and how that's going to impact my character itself. And that's the extent to which I render. And it looks fine from afar, but if you zoom in, then that's where you can tell all of the brush strokes. Now, as I've mentioned at the beginning of the video, I value personality quite a bit, and I think this part of the way you render and actually how efficient you are and what kind of brush marks you decide to leave in, that adds a lot of personality to the character as well. And I think a lot of people could do with just putting a little bit more of that personal flair in there. And brush economy is not a fundamental skill. A fundamental skill is knowing when to stop rendering, knowing how far to take something, and knowing how to work a bit more efficiently, perhaps. Because it is all about just finding the most efficient way to describe the form of your character, to describe the character that's in front of you, to make them the most readable. The tricky thing as well is the thumbnails that I made were a lot more basic than this, of course, and were very graphic in nature. And you don't want to lose that as you start rendering. So you have to have a little bit of precognition almost at the start of your design process to imagine having a sculpt of your character, having it turn around while you're doing the thumbnail. Because it's gonna have to be appealing from all kinds of different angles, and in this case, it's not a vastly different pose from the thumbnail itself, but still, it is definitely just at a solid point where I think I've gotten the main appealing features of the thumbnail across. I've actually enhanced some other features, did change the design a little bit, but keeping that original charm, very, very difficult to get, and awesome if you can make it work. Now, for the most part, this design isn't really too impressive or anything. I'm quite happy with the way it turned out. My character is definitely, I'm excited to see where the story is going to go. And hopefully there's going to be more opportunities to add to the design as we go through our story, because right now he's a bit more of a blank sheet. So as his story will progress, I will hopefully redesign him as well and make sure that I get to a point where he's nice and finished. As you can see, I actually had a little bit of post-processing after the design process, and I got to this point, adding a little bit of armor, and here he is. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed watching me fiddle around with these designs for a little bit. It's definitely not the most structured design process, but hopefully it'll give you guys some ideas, at least, as to how far you can push shapes, how you can play around with character designs. I really love character design, so again, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and feel free to stick around and watch out for the next one. Bye-bye.